They sent us out just after dawn. The air still held that sharp bite of early spring, and the lake was quiet. Too quiet, if you asked me. I'd worked Crater Lake for nearly 10 years, and even on still mornings like this, you could usually hear birds, the buzz of insects, maybe the rustle of trees. But not today. I was Ranger Wade Branning. Cody Hayes, my closest friend and fellow ranger, rode up beside me on his ATV, his jaw tight like he'd been grinding his teeth since sunrise. Behind us were a couple of scientists and 2 FBI agents in plain clothes, trying to play it cool, but clearly spooked. We were headed toward a cave system that wasn't on any map, one that hadn't existed until last week. A rockslide opened it up near the eastern ridge, just above the lake. That in itself was odd. There hadn't been any seismic activity reported. No tremors. No warning. Just one morning, hikers saw a gaping hole in the side of the mountain, like the earth had yawned and split itself open. We stopped at the cave entrance, and even with the sun up, the opening looked like the mouth of something ancient and hungry. The scientists unpacked their gear, sensor arrays, sample kits, and a high-frequency scanner that made a quiet, pulsing sound like a heartbeat. No one said much. Cody leaned over and muttered, "Feel that?" I did. A kind of low vibration in my boots, like the ground was breathing. It wasn't constant, just came and went in slow, deliberate pulses. We all strapped on headlamps and descended into the dark. The air changed as soon as we crossed the threshold. Thicker, colder, damp like a basement that hadn't been opened in decades. Our footsteps echoed in unnatural ways, like the walls were folding the sound back at us, bending it. We walked single file, the FBI agents in the middle, the scientists behind them. Cody and I took the front and rear. About 100 feet in, the passage narrowed and sloped downward. That's when we started seeing the markings, not carvings, not scratches. These were patterns. Circular, precise, layered in a way that reminded me of coral or the inside of a seashell. Bioluminescent. Faint. Just enough to see by. The scanner started clicking faster. "It's responding to something," one of the scientists whispered, checking the display. "What kind of mineral lights up like that?" Cody asked, shining his flashlight over one of the patterns. It shimmered slightly, like it was alive. That's when we heard it. A whisper. Not words, not really, but something close enough that our brains tried to make sense of it. The sound wasn't coming from around us. It was inside us, like an idea someone else had planted in your head. We kept moving. Another 50 yards in, the cave opened up into a chamber the size of a gymnasium. The scanner went nuts. Lights on the device turned red. One of the scientists dropped his gear. Then everything shifted. The air pressure changed, like a plane taking off, ears popping, dizziness washing over us. From the far side of the chamber, something moved. Not walked, moved, with a glide that didn't belong to anything that lived on land. We raised our weapons. Cody's voice was steady. "Identify yourself." No response. The thing came closer, half in the shadows. It stood upright, tall, almost 7 feet, but not human. Its limbs were too long. The skin was slick, wet-looking, the color of deep-sea fish. No eyes we could see, just slits that pulsed with faint blue light. It stopped about 20 feet from us. That's when it hit us. Visions. Not memories, visions. Like someone hijacked our thoughts and flooded our heads with images. We saw black water, endless depths, structures buried under the lake, glowing with strange symbols. We saw people, standing still underwater like statues. Not dead. Waiting. The creature raised one long arm toward the scientists. They broke first. One of them screamed, dropped his pack, and bolted for the passage. The other followed. The creature moved to intercept, its speed impossible to track. Cody fired. Bullets tore through its arm, and the limb fell to the floor, but didn't stop moving. It rose again, twitching like it had its own will. The thing screamed, but not with sound. It screamed straight into our bones. It backed off a few steps, black fluid oozing from the wound, still watching us. Go! Nakamura, the lead FBI agent, shouted. Back to the entrance. We fell back in a scramble, Cody covering us, firing short bursts to keep it back. It didn't charge, just followed. Slow, sideways, like it was hurting us. One of the agents stumbled, dropped his flashlight. The second he did, the creature surged forward. Claws raked across his vest, but another agent pulled him back before it could finish the job. We didn't stop running until daylight broke through the tunnel mouth. The thing didn't follow. Maybe it hated the sun. Maybe it just didn't need to. Outside, the tactical team opened fire at the entrance. The gunfire echoed through the mountains like thunder. Still, the creature never came out. We didn't wait to see if it would. We loaded up and drove out, fast. No one said a word for miles. Just the sounds of engines and the wind rushing past. Back at headquarters, they called it a zoological anomaly, a biological unknown, a non-human life form. But deep down, we all knew what we saw, and it wasn't alone. Back at the ranger station, the silence felt heavier than it ever had in the cave. We sat in the break room, Cody, me, the two remaining scientists, and the FBI team. None of us spoke for a while. Just the low hum of the vending machine and the drip of stale coffee into a pot nobody would drink. They're calling it an anomaly, one of the agents finally said, staring blankly at his phone. Some kind of deep earth species, possibly undiscovered. I said nothing, because I knew what we saw wasn't just undiscovered. It was wrong. Cody leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. It showed us things, he muttered. Those images, the lake bottom, the structures, people underwater. The room went quiet again. That night, they ordered a full evacuation of the park. The cave was sealed with concrete. A temporary quarantine perimeter was thrown up, and official statements were released blaming it all on a dangerous geological collapse. Tourists were turned away. Helicopters came and went. We weren't allowed back in. A few days later, Cody and I drove to the hospital in Medford. Janet Croft, the woman who'd first disappeared near the cave weeks ago, had been found unconscious at the water's edge the morning after our encounter. Nobody knew how she'd gotten out. She hadn't woken up since. We needed to see her. Inside the ICU, the fluorescent lights made everything feel too sterile, too clean, like the place was trying to scrub out the memories from our heads. The floor supervisor blocked us at first. She's not receiving visitors, she said firmly. Doctor's orders. Cody didn't blink. This is a matter of public safety. We need to see her now. The woman's jaw tensed. Her condition is unchanged. Stable, but unresponsive. Her husband is with her. Then, as if summoned by the tension, Paul Croft stepped out from the hospital room. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes darted between us, then settled. She spoke, he said. What did she say? I asked. He swallowed. She said, they're waking up now. All of them. Then she went quiet again. The blood drained from Cody's face. I felt it too. That sudden drop in temperature. That tightening of the chest. Can we see her? I asked. Paul hesitated, then gave a slight nod. If you can make sense of it, be my guest. Janet looked peaceful in the bed, too peaceful. Her skin had a strange tone, almost pale blue beneath the hospital lights. Tubes snaked from her arms. A heart monitor beeped steadily, but something was off. Her fingers were twitching, not random, patterned, repetitive. Has she done that before? Cody asked. Paul nodded. Started yesterday. Neurologists said it looks like some kind of sign language, but it's not one they recognize. I moved closer, watching the rhythm of her fingers. It was familiar, not human. The same pattern we'd seen carved into the cave walls. Then I noticed the discoloration on her arms. Faint, almost hidden under the skin. Bioluminescent streaks. Like the creature. She needs to be quarantined, Cody said sharply. Isolated. Blood samples secured. What's happening to my wife? Paul demanded, his voice rising. Before we could answer, Janet's eyes snapped open. We froze. Her pupils. No, not pupils anymore. Had expanded to cover the whites completely. jet black, with faint swirling blue patterns like deep-sea plankton under moonlight. "They've been waiting," she said in a voice that was hers and not. "Sleeping in the deep while you crawled across the land. Watching. Learning." Paul staggered back. "Janet." Her head turned to him like it was on a swivel. "Janet sees now. And soon, so will you." Her eyes locked on me. "Ranger Branning, you interfered. You glimpsed the truth, and still you resist. Inefficient." I lunged for the call button, but her hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. She was strong, inhumanly strong. Her grip felt like steel cable wrapped in skin. I couldn't move. "More are awakening," she said. "Not just here. In all the deep places." Cody drew his sidearm and fired into the ceiling. The bang echoed down the hallway. Alarms blared. Janet released me and slumped back into the bed, her eyes closing like a switch had been flipped. Chaos erupted. Nurses rushed in. Security stormed the hallway. We were pulled back, questioned, separated. FBI agents arrived within minutes. Nakamura herself showed up. Within an hour, the room was sealed. Janet was moved to an underground CDC facility. In a debriefing, a CDC doctor showed us microscope images of her blood. "These aren't viruses. Not bacteria," he said. "They're synthetic, biological constructs. And they're building something in her nervous system." "You mean she's infected?" Cody asked. "Colonized," one of the researchers corrected. "Her brain is being reprogrammed." "She's a mouthpiece," I said. "A voice for them." Everyone went quiet. That night, I sat with Cody in the ranger station again, staring into my cold coffee. "They think they can contain it," he said. "Fence it off. Call it a new species. Pretend it's just another cave anomaly." "But you don't believe that," I replied. He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't just showing us. It was preparing us." A few days passed with no word, no updates, no new sightings, just silence. The kind that doesn't calm you, but presses in on your chest like something watching and waiting. Then came the call. Janet Croft had flatlined, and then come back. They said her vitals had stopped for exactly 2 minutes. No heartbeat, no brain activity. Then suddenly, life. A spike on the monitor, followed by a full resumption of bodily functions. But she didn't speak, didn't open her eyes. Just returned to that eerie state of stillness, twitching her fingers against the sheets in that same unnatural rhythm. The lab tests came back the next morning. Her blood had changed, fundamentally. The synthetic structures were spreading, not attacking her cells, but rewriting them, building new neural pathways over the old ones like circuitry. The CDC called it the most advanced bioengineering they'd ever seen, far beyond human capability. They didn't say the word alien, but they didn't need to. Meanwhile, the rest of us were stuck in limbo, neither dismissed nor involved. Cody and I were ordered to stay local, in case further insight was needed. I spent most of those days staring out the window of my cabin, watching the lake through binoculars, waiting for the water to move again. Then came the sonar report. In a secure briefing room surrounded by armed guards and stone-faced officials, Nakamura showed us a series of grainy images captured by deep-scan sonar equipment. At first, it looked like static. Then, clearer, patterns, shapes, architecture. At the bottom of Crater Lake, 2,000 feet down, was a cluster of impossible structures, geometric, symmetrical, yet unnatural, like temples or pylons. The angles made no sense. They bent light in strange ways, even in the sonar. Based on sediment layering, the geologists said, these formations date back at least 7,700 years, possibly more. Older than any known civilization on this continent, an anthropologist added. Cody and I looked at each other. It was what we saw in our heads. Those visions the creature pushed into our minds hadn't been symbolic. They were real. Blueprints. Memory. There's movement, the sonar tech said, pointing to a cluster of flickering signals near the largest formation. Multiple heat signatures, similar in size and shape to the entity you encountered. How many? Nakamura asked. At least 24, maybe more. Nobody spoke for a while. 24 like the one that nearly ripped through us in the cave. Cody exhaled slowly. If Janet's just the first, then there are others already out there. Nakamura leaned forward, her face tight. This is no longer a containment issue. It's a biological incursion. That night, I officially resigned from the National Park Service. Cody did the same. What were we going to do? Go back to writing trail reports and chasing off rowdy campers, knowing what was sleeping beneath that water. They gave us an exit interview. We signed papers, promises not to speak. Then we disappeared. I bought a small cabin up near Flathead National Forest in Montana. High elevation. No lakes nearby. I filtered every drop of well water. Stayed away from town. Stopped answering most emails. But I kept watching, reading between the lines of local news reports. Strange closures. Mysterious illnesses. Campsites abandoned. Missing people. Once, 3 months in, I got a message from Cody through a secure remailer. Just one sentence. They're testing the edges of my mind. Stay sharp. I wanted to believe it was just trauma. Paranoia. But then it started happening to me too. Dreams. Vivid wet. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, ears ringing. I saw flashes of the lake at night, its water silver and still, the surface beginning to rise like it was breathing. Then shapes, limbs, breaking through, climbing out, moving toward the trees. Sometimes, I'd find pages in my notebook filled with symbols I didn't remember writing. Sometimes, I'd feel the pressure in my skull, not a headache, but a presence, gently pushing at the boundaries of my thoughts like fingers tapping on glass. 6 months after the cave, Janet Croft died. Or rather, what remained of her did. The reports were heavily redacted, but Nakamura shared what she could. The transformation had completed. Her body adapted for deep-sea life. Organs rearranged, skin bioluminescent, eyes enlarged. She didn't decay. She changed, became something else. Paul Croft vanished shortly after. His car was found abandoned near the lake. No note, no witnesses. We both knew where he'd gone. A year passed. Then, out of nowhere, Nakamura reached out again. A diner in Missoula. She looked different, tired, unshaven, a streak of white in her hair. "It's happening elsewhere," she said, no small talk. 3 more cases. One at Lake Tahoe, one in Puget Sound, one in Yellowstone Lake. She slid a folder across the table. Maps. Dozens of red dots across North America. Deep lakes. Unusual sonar returns. "How many of these are active?" I asked. "Too many." She locked eyes with me. "We need to understand how you and Cody resisted. Everyone else who's made contact has changed." I stared at her, cold dread curling in my gut. "You think we're immune?" "No," she said. "I think you're slower to change. But it's still happening." She tapped her temple. "You feel it, don't you? In here." I didn't answer. That night, I packed what little I had and fled again. I left the cabin, the phone, the cards. Everything traceable. I headed north, deep into the mountains. I stopped trusting anything with running water, because I knew what was coming, and I wasn't ready to give in yet. 3 winters passed. I lived alone in an abandoned fire lookout tower high in the Bitterroot Range, 9,000 feet up, buried in snow, nothing but wind and trees for miles. There was no running water, no power, no signal. I melted snow to drink, rationed food I'd hauled up in the fall, and slept with a shotgun beside me. It wasn't survival. It was hiding, and even that didn't feel safe anymore. The isolation played tricks on my mind. I started talking to myself. At first just thinking out loud, then full conversations. Then arguments. I tried to write things down, anything to stay grounded. My notebooks filled up with diagrams I couldn't explain, notes I didn't remember writing. But the worst were the dreams. They came in waves. Every few nights, I'd feel it building, like something pulling at the corners of my consciousness. And when I finally slept, it wasn't really sleep. I saw things. Dark, wet corridors. Ancient lights pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. A pressure rising in the lake like something breathing in the deep. Sometimes, I'd wake up at the lookout's edge, barefoot in the snow, no memory of how I got there. One night, with wind howling and the temperature near 30 below, someone knocked on my door. That was impossible. The only road in was buried under 10 feet of snow. No vehicle could have made it. No one should have been up there. But the knocking came again, rhythmic. A slow, deliberate pattern. I raised my shotgun and shouted through the door. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a voice, muffled by the storm. "Wait, it's me. It's Cody." My breath caught. My hands trembled. I hadn't seen Cody Hayes in over a year. "Prove it." I called back, still aiming down the barrel. A pause. Then, "The day we met, you had a tuna sandwich. Offered me half. I told you I was allergic. You ate both halves and complained about being hungry 2 hours later." That stupid detail. So human. So specific. I unlatched the door and pulled it open against the wind. Cody stumbled in, beard to his chest, hair matted, eyes darting like he hadn't slept in days. He looked like a man who'd been chased across the continent by something only he could see. "Lock it," he gasped. "They can't enter unless they're invited, but they'll try to make you want to." I bolted the door behind him and watched as he sank to the floor, coughing into his gloves. He looked up with hollow eyes. "They've been watching you. Like they've been watching me. They know who we are now." We sat in silence for a while, huddled near the propane stove as I made coffee. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a metal container. Inside was a crystal, blue-green, rough, glowing faintly even in the dim light. Something about it made the pressure in my skull ease instantly. That background hum, the alien whisper I'd gotten used to, it faded like a radio tuning to static. "This stops them?" I asked, staring at it. "Not permanently," he said, "but it interferes with their signal." Bought me time. Bought us time. "Where'd you get it?" "Alaska, in the Brooks Range. There's a geothermal pocket up there. The Inuit used to call them quiet stones." Thought it was just folklore. It's not. It's real. And there's more. Enough to build safe zones. He said it like a man desperate for hope. "They're in the water now, Wade," Cody whispered. "Not just lakes. Water systems. Municipal supplies. Wells. Bottled water. They've created microscopic versions of themselves, biological drones, that slip through filters, pass through the body, and rewrite people from the inside." I stared into my mug, suddenly nauseous. "How many?" I asked. "Millions," he said. "Most don't even know. They're just off. More tired. More compliant. Obsessed with water. Drawn to lakes and rivers for no reason." He leaned in. "There are entire towns now, Wade. Fully converted. Places that seem normal. Stores, schools, smiling faces. But no one's there anymore. Just shells. All listening to the same voice." The wind slammed against the lookout walls, making them groan. "You still trust me?" he asked. "I don't trust anything," I replied. "But I'm listening." He nodded. "There's a research station in the Clearwater Mountains. People like us. Resistors. Scientists. Former agents. They're trying to fight back. And I have proof now that the crystals work. We can build a real defense." He paused, eyes dark. "But we have to leave. Now. Because they know we're together." I didn't argue. We packed everything we could carry before dawn. The wind had died down, but the cold still bit through every layer. As we stepped out into the snow, I looked back at the tower, my refuge, my prison, my grave that never claimed me. I didn't know if I'd ever come back. All I knew was the war had already begun, and hiding was no longer an option. We pushed north through the snow-covered wilderness, following no trail, no marked path, just Cody's instinct and a compass that spun in strange directions anytime we got too close to water. The air felt heavier by the hour, like something massive washed us from beneath the surface of the land itself. The first 2 days were brutal. Waist-deep snow slowed our pace to a crawl, and freezing fog rolled in each afternoon, muffling all sound and turning trees into ghostly shapes. Cody seemed to navigate by something deeper than sight, some pulse or sense I couldn't fully grasp. "Stick to my tracks," he warned over and over. "Don't listen to voices. Don't look toward the water." On the third day, just before dusk, we heard someone call my name from behind us. A familiar voice. It was my dad's. I stopped in my tracks, heart thudding. My father had died when I was 16. "Wade." The voice said again, weaker this time, almost pleading. Cody grabbed my arm hard. "Don't. It's not him." He pulled me forward through the snow, even as the voice faded behind us, swallowed by the fog. I didn't look back. We kept moving. By nightfall, we reached a narrow ridge and saw a small cabin tucked beneath a granite outcrop, just as Cody had said. Supposedly built decades ago by fire surveyors, now abandoned, and surrounded by snowdrifts higher than the door. But there was light inside. I raised my rifle, motioning for Cody to stop. "There shouldn't be anyone here," I whispered. "I know," he said grimly. We approached slowly. No footprints, no smoke, just that dim glow flickering behind frosted windows. When we knocked, no one answered. I eased the door open. Inside, the wood stove was glowing with hot embers. A tin cup of coffee still steamed on the table. The place was warm, lived in, but empty. No footprints, no sign of departure. Just a journal lying open beside the cup, its pages filled with tight handwriting, until the last line, scrawled across the page in frantic strokes. "The snow speaks. The lake remembers. I was never alone." We didn't stay. We moved on into the trees and made camp half a mile away. Built no fire. Used blackout tarps. Slept in shifts. That night, I dreamed of Crater Lake again, but not as it was. In the dream, the water had risen, swallowing the crater rim, overflowing into the valleys below. Cities drowned. Mountains cracked open. Something moved through the floodwaters, not swimming, but drifting just beneath the surface, watching. I woke in a sweat. Next morning, we were almost to the research outpost when we heard the sounds, soft, deliberate footfalls in the snow. At least 6 of them, maybe more. Cody knelt beside a pine tree, scanning the ridgeline with his scope. "Former rangers," he muttered. "I recognized 2 of them. Good men. One of them saved my life once." I stayed silent, watching the figures move with mechanical precision through the trees. No hesitation, no calls between them. "What do we do?" I asked. "We don't shoot," Cody said. "They're not enemies. Not really. They're infected, converted, but they're still in there. Somewhere." The figures stopped about 50 yards away. One of them, tall, with a patchy gray beard and park ranger's jacket, tilted his head toward us, sniffing the air like an animal. Then, without a word, they moved on. Just vanished into the trees. We didn't breathe until they were gone. "They're not tracking us exactly," Cody whispered. "The crystal disrupts their connection, but they can still sense us in flashes. We need to move." We made it to the research station that afternoon, barely more than a series of reinforced trailers strung along a ridgeline, camouflaged under tarps and snow. But inside, it was alive with quiet activity. Researchers with dark circles under their eyes, satellite gear, defense monitors, shelves lined with canisters of blue-green crystal dust. They didn't ask who we were. They already knew. That night, I stood by the outer fence, staring down at the vast forest below, the sun setting behind a wall of fog that never seemed to lift anymore. They were out there. I could feel it. Watching, listening, waiting. Cody joined me, wrapped in his heavy coat, sipping from a mug. "We bought a little time," he said. "But that's all it is." I didn't answer, because deep in my bones, I knew the truth. This wasn't a fight we could win by force. It wasn't a war for land or power. It was a war for the mind. And we'd only just begun. The research station in the Clearwater Mountains wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a handful of steel-framed trailers buried under snow and camouflage netting. But inside, it felt like stepping into another world. The air smelled like ozone and copper. Monitors hummed quietly. The walls were covered with maps, sonar readouts, strange mineral samples, and rows of weapons modified with unfamiliar tech. We were greeted by a woman named Dr. Elsie Monroe, a former geophysicist turned resistance researcher. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week, but when she saw the crystals Cody carried, her eyes lit up with something like hope. "You actually found it," she said, almost breathless. "Real Brooksite. We've only seen traces in geothermal vents, never a clean deposit." Cody nodded. "That's just the start. There's more. A lot more." They tested the sample immediately, measuring its electromagnetic properties, placing it near encrypted hard drives and communication nodes. And then something happened I hadn't expected. The pressure in my head, the constant low-level buzz I'd learned to live with since Crater Lake, faded. Not entirely, but enough to make my thoughts feel like mine again. "You feel it too?" Cody asked. I nodded. It's like someone turned down the volume in my brain. Elsie was already typing up a report. These crystals don't just block their influence. They scramble the resonance frequency that lets them communicate across bodies of water. With enough of this material, we can create safe zones, mental dead spots they can't penetrate. For the first time in months, I let myself believe there might be a future. Not just survival, but resistance. A real one. But that hope didn't last long. The next morning, while Cody helped reinforce the station's signal jammers, I went out with a 2-person scout team to collect water samples from a nearby frozen stream. The lead scout, Rena, a former Forest Service biologist, was explaining local shifts in animal behavior when we found a fresh set of prints in the snow. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, something in between. The stride was wrong, too long for a person, too heavy for any known animal. And whatever it was, it had claws. 5 of them, curved, each one the size of a pocket knife. "Has to be one of them," Rena muttered, raising her weapon. "They're testing us, seeing how close they can get before we notice." She was right. When we got back, the station perimeter alarms were already lighting up, short pulses, not full triggers, but signs of movement just outside the field's range. "They're not attacking," Elsie said, reviewing the logs. "They're listening, watching, learning how the crystal network behaves." That night, we doubled the perimeter guard and stayed up in shifts. I sat alone by the northern lookout post, watching the dark tree line below. The snow had stopped, but the wind carried a scent I recognized immediately, like damp stone and burnt ozone. And then the whispers came, not from outside, from inside my own skull. It wasn't words, more like suggestions, images. Crater Lake, Janet Croft, Hall, walking into the water, my own face, floating beneath a glassy surface. A simple message, repeated again and again. "You're not alone. You're never alone." I pressed my hand against the nearest crystal node. The pressure eased, but not all the way. They were getting smarter, stronger. By morning, Cody and I knew what we had to do. "We can't stay on defense forever," he told me over a breakfast of freeze-dried eggs and instant coffee. "They're going to overrun every place we've set up eventually. We need to find the source," I said. "Find the biggest deposit of that mineral. Build a fortress around it." "We already have a location," Elsie said quietly from behind us. She slid a folder onto the table. "It's risky, deep in the Canadian Rockies. Hard to reach. But our satellite scans show the strongest signal interference ever recorded. Enough to throw off even military-grade sonar." "What's there?" Cody asked. Elsie hesitated. "Something old. Something buried. We don't think it's natural, but the crystal grows around it. Like armor." A silence passed between us. Then I stood. "When do we leave?" 2 days, she said. "Helicopter teams prepping now. You'll want to rest." But I couldn't rest. That night, I had another dream. I was back at Crater Lake. The water was gone, drained away, and in its place was a gaping pit of black stone, lined with impossible symbols that shifted when I blinked. In the center, something moved. A figure with too many arms. No face, just eyes, hundreds of them, blinking in unison. "The time is short," it said, in a voice made of crushed ice and cracking stone. We were patient. Now we rise. I woke gasping, cold sweat, nose bleeding. The crystal on my nightstand had cracked down the middle. They were getting in again, and we were running out of time. We lifted off just before dawn, the helicopter skimming low over pine forests draped in mist. Cody sat across from me, checking our gear with practiced efficiency. Across from him, Dr. Elsie Monroe gripped a hard case packed with raw brooksite crystal. Her knuckles were white. None of us had slept. The destination was deep in the Canadian Rockies. No trails, no towns, just a series of jagged ridgelines and frozen valleys accessible only by air. The pilot, a former SAR operator named Mel, didn't speak much. She just flew, eyes fixed on the horizon like something was chasing us. It was 2 hours into the flight. Cody nudged me and nodded toward the radio. We were picking up static, low, rhythmic pulses. Mel tapped her headset. That's not us. Elsie paled. It's them. They're broadcasting now. Openly. She popped open the crystal case and handed me a small pendant laced with copper. I slipped it over my neck, and the static faded slightly, like turning a dial just enough to dull the headache. They're trying to jam navigation, she said. They know where we're going. Mel cursed under her breath and adjusted course, skimming lower through a narrow mountain pass. We'll be flying blind soon. Get ready to move fast. As we crested the ridge, I saw it. A massive crater nestled between cliffs, snow swirling through the air like ashes. And in the center, half buried in ice, was a structure that didn't belong in this world. It looked like a cathedral made of bone and obsidian, all sharp edges and wrong geometry. Shapes that didn't make sense. Angles that hurt to look at too long. Crystals pulsed from the surrounding ice like veins, casting an eerie blue-green light. We call it the vault, Elsie said, her voice barely audible over the rotor wash. The strongest signal we've ever recorded comes from inside it. We landed fast. The helicopter barely touched the ground before we were offloading supplies. Cody and I took point, weapons raised, scanning the snowfield. No movement, no wind, just that constant hum beneath the surface. It was like standing on the skin of something massive, just barely asleep. Our goal was simple: get inside, plant signal dampeners, and recover any source material. Maybe find answers. Maybe find a way to stop the spread. We made it to the vault's outer wall in 10 minutes. It wasn't built by human hands. The surface was smooth, seamless, and warm to the touch. The door, or what passed for one, responded to Elsie's crystal like a key. With a sharp hiss, it folded inward, revealing a hallway that sloped down into darkness. Cody looked at me. You ready for this? Not even a little, I muttered. We stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, like we'd walked into a freezer. The light from our flashlights bounced strangely, almost slow, like it was moving through water. And the walls were covered in symbols. Not carved, grown, pulsing faintly with blue light. They reminded me of the markings we saw on Janet Croft's skin. Stay close, Elsie said, voice shaking. This place isn't stable. As we descended, we heard it. Not voices exactly, more like memories. Whispered thoughts that didn't belong to us. Images flashing in our minds. Oceans boiling, stars shifting, creatures made of light swimming through a world before ours. They were here before everything, Elsie whispered. Before us. They went into the earth when the sky changed. When the oceans died. They waited. The passage opened into a central chamber, vast and circular, the ceiling lost in shadow. At the center was a crystalline column, about 12 feet tall, surrounded by frozen figures. People, or what was left of them. Their bodies were preserved in ice, but changed, elongated limbs, bulbous eyes, skin laced with crystal veins. They weren't just dead. They were becoming something else. They didn't die here, Cody said. They came willingly. Elsie approached the column carefully, placing a handheld scanner against its surface. The screen lit up with noise, waveforms and signals bouncing wildly. "This is it," she said. "This is the core, the central node for their hive mind transmission system. If we can isolate its frequency, we can block it everywhere." Then the chamber shook. A low, guttural sound echoed through the walls. Not mechanical, not natural, alive. I raised my rifle. Something's coming. The air thickened. Lights flickered. The walls began to move, slow undulations like breathing. From one of the side tunnels, something stepped out. It was like the creature from Crater Lake, but bigger, taller, more defined. Its skin shimmered with that same oily blackness. Eyes, dozens of them, blinked in perfect sync across its head and chest. Its arms were too long, fingers tipped in crystalline claws. It didn't charge. It watched. "Don't shoot," Elsie said softly. "It's scanning us." The thing cocked its head. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like someone reaching into my skull and rifling through my memories. Crater Lake, Janet, the fire tower, the hospital. My thoughts weren't mine anymore. Then, a voice, not spoken, but felt. "You found the place of our sleep. The key, the wound, the bridge." Cody staggered backward, bleeding from the nose. "We need to get out of here," I said. Elsie nodded. "I've got the signal data. Let's move." But the thing didn't follow us. It let us leave, like it wanted us to. Back on the surface, Mel was already prepping for liftoff, eyes wide with panic. "They're coming. Whole ridge is lighting up like a goddamn Christmas tree." We stirred something. As we lifted off, I looked back. The vault was glowing now, pulsing with blue fire beneath the snow, like a heartbeat. And I realized something. They let us see it. Let us take the data. Let us spread it. Because it wasn't just about Crater Lake anymore. It never was. The data we pulled from the vault changed everything. Back at Bulwark Station, the entire team was waiting when we landed. Technicians swarmed the helicopter before the rotors had even stopped spinning. Elsie handed off the drive with the core signal readings like it was a live explosive. We were rushed inside, through decontamination, then straight to a secure analysis bay. I could see it in everyone's eyes. Excitement, fear, the gnawing edge of something way too big to handle but too important to ignore. They pulled Cody aside for a medical scan. He'd started bleeding again on the flight back, and there was something off about his pupils, like they weren't dilating right. He kept saying he was fine, but I saw him glance at shadows like they were whispering to him. Elsie and I were brought into a briefing room where Dr. Lee, the head of neural analytics, was already building visual models of the data stream from the vault. It wasn't just a signal, it was a map. A pulsating, layered code that represented connection points between all known bodies of deep water in North America. Not just Crater Lake, not just the Rockies. Every lake, every reservoir, every major aquifer. "They've seeded them all," Dr. Lee said, voice low. "Slowly, quietly, over decades, maybe centuries. Each one is a node. And now the central node has come online." "Why now?" I asked. "We think the vault was a failsafe," Elsie answered. "Something dormant until the other nodes reached a certain threshold. And now it's awake," I said. She nodded. "Which means they are too." The next 48 hours were chaos. Teams across the country, Canada, the US, even one in Mexico, reported spikes in signal activity. Remote lakes lit up with low-frequency pulses. Water treatment plants began flagging abnormalities in their systems. In isolated communities, people were acting strange, speaking in monotone, repeating phrases like "the deep calls" or "time to merge." There were blackouts, communication failures. In Maine, an entire fishing village was found empty, boats drifting, food still warm on stoves. Just gone. Whatever had been sleeping was now moving. I spent hours helping develop field deployment kits, portable crystal dampeners meant to neutralize local signals for small groups. It was a patch, not a solution, like sandbags against a rising flood. And through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. That night, I found Cody sitting alone in the armory, staring at his boots. "They showed me something," he said, "when we were down there. Not just images, instructions." "For what?" He hesitated. "Conversion. Voluntary integration. They want us to understand how beautiful it is to be one mind. One purpose. They think we're broken. Fragmented. You don't believe them, do you?" "No," he said quickly. Then, softer, "But part of me wanted to." I didn't sleep that night. Neither did most of the station. Everyone could feel it, like pressure behind the eyes. The air too still. The walls too quiet. In the early morning, the alarms went off. Not drills. Not tests. Real perimeter breach. By the time I made it to the control room, Nakamura was already there, suited up, sidearm on her hip. Screens showed movement on the southern slope. A small group of figures approaching fast, but moving wrong. Too smooth. Too in sync. "Who are they?" I asked. "Converted personnel," she said. "A former research outpost 40 miles from here went dark yesterday. No survivors. We think they're." The wall monitors blinked out, then came back. Only this time, every screen showed the same thing. Janet Croft. Not her in the hospital. Not her body. Something else. The version of her that looked through black, glowing eyes and spoke with that mechanical cadence. "You took the key," she said, her voice warping through static. "Now the door opens. Welcome." The screens went dark. A second later, the facility shook. Deep, low vibrations from below. Not an explosion. Something worse. Something alive. "Underground breach," one of the engineers shouted. "They're tunneling straight through the bedrock." Elsie ran and holding a prototype crystal array. "We can't stop them," she said, "but we can isolate them. If we flood the tunnels with this frequency, it'll block communication between them. Cut them off." "You sure?" Nakamura asked. "No." "Then we try it." While teams moved to deploy the array, I grabbed my gear. Cody was already ahead of me, loading shells into a pump-action shotgun. There was no way we were sitting this one out. "They want us connected," he said. "Let's show them we remember how to disconnect." We made it to the lower levels just as the first of them broke through, a figure that had once been human but now moved like a puppet. Blank face, skin slick and veined with that same blue glow. It opened its mouth and let out a pulse, sound and thought at the same time. I felt my knees buckle. My nose bled. The part of my mind that still remembered Janet screamed. But the moment Cody activated the crystal array, the pulse stopped. They froze. Not dead. Not gone. Just severed. Like snakes with the head cut off. But that was just one tunnel. There were more. Too many more. We retreated to the upper levels. Nakamura was coordinating evacuation, but the situation was falling apart fast. Systems failing. Lights flickering. Some of the staff were already acting strange, slow to respond, eyes glassy. They were in the air now. Through water. Through sweat. Through breath. We sealed the inner chamber and prepared the final protocol. A full collapse of Bulwark Station. "Are you sure?" I asked. Nakamura looked at the screen showing the incoming tunnels. "Dozens of them now. We can't let this place fall into their hands." We activated the failsafe. The countdown started. 10 minutes to collapse. We loaded into the last evac chopper, the engine groaning from the cold, the rotors struggling in the wind. Cody handed me a crystal shard, just a sliver, but still warm to the touch. "For whatever comes next," he said. As we lifted off, I looked back at Bulwark. The mountain cracked inward, snow and stone folding like paper as the facility imploded. And from the depths, something moved. Something enormous. Not killed. Not even slowed. Just aware. Watching. As we rose into the gray sky, I realized we'd won a moment, not a war. And Crater Lake? That was just the beginning. The weeks after the fall of Bulwark Station passed like smoke. Drifting, choking, impossible to hold on to. We were relocated to a temporary resistance cell in northern Idaho, just outside of Coeur d'Alene. A safe house with blackout curtains, backup generators, and spring-fed water filtered through layers of quartz and clay. For a while, It felt like we'd carved out a tiny island in a rising ocean of influence. But the pressure never stopped. Even here, far from Crater Lake, I could feel them pressing in. Not with claws or teeth, but with thoughts. Memories that weren't mine. Dreams that bled into waking life. Faces of people I'd never met, calling to me from dark water. Elsie didn't sleep much. She was working with scattered teams across North America, trying to replicate the crystal resonance fields in more durable forms. Wearables, water purification inserts, even something that looked like a high-tech inhaler meant to purge early-stage neural contamination. I didn't ask where the testing happened. Some days, Cody would disappear into the woods for hours, sometimes a full day. He said it helped clear the fog in his head. He'd come back muddy, scraped up, and silent, always carrying something strange. A broken deer antler, a handful of moss glowing faintly in the dark, once even a polished stone with patterns like veins or circuitry. "We're not the first to fight them," he said once. "This land remembers. It doesn't want them back either." We started hearing rumors. Not official briefings, just chatter on the resistance net. Whole towns going silent near deep reservoirs. Bodies surfacing in lakes with no signs of drowning, but their faces locked in peaceful smiles. A ranger in Utah who burned down an entire visitor center after seeing something sitting in the rain, looking up with eyes like glass. Nakamura sent us a secure message one night. Her new base was mobile now, an old cargo train retrofitted as a rolling lab, moving constantly across the Midwest. Safer that way. Harder to predict. Harder to surround. She attached a single photo. A sonar image from Lake Michigan. Dozens of rising forms. All moving toward the surface. I stared at the image for a long time. Tried not to think about what would happen when the big lakes woke up. The Great Lakes. Lake Tahoe. Lake Superior. We'd thought Crater Lake was the start. It wasn't. It was just the first one we saw. One night, I woke up to the sound of Cody screaming. I ran into his room, found him standing in front of the mirror, shaking. "They called me by my real name," he said. I didn't know what that meant. Neither did he. But he looked broken. The next morning, he was gone. Left a note. "Going north, where the sky opens and the earth listens. I'll find something. Or I'll become something. Keep the light on." I haven't seen him since. Elsie and I moved south eventually. Set up a signal monitoring station in Arizona near a defunct military observatory. The dry air and high elevation helped. Less interference. Less presence. One day, she came running in with a signal trace. Pure resonance. No corruption. A transmission we'd never seen before. Short, but clearly human. It said, "We remember who we are. We are not yours." A small win. A light in the dark. We blasted that message across every resistance frequency we had, over and over. And for the first time in months, I felt something real. Not hope exactly, but defiance. I still dream of the lake. Still hear the voice, Janet's voice, or what used to be hers, whispering from beneath the surface. They're coming. They were always coming. But now I whisper back. So are we. Because maybe we're not meant to win. Maybe we're just meant to hold the line long enough for someone else to. To be the warning, the memory, the ember that refuses to go out. And until the last drop of clean water runs. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt louder than usual as I sat across from Director Carmichael. Her office was buried 4 levels beneath the surface in a facility that technically didn't exist. She slid a manila folder across the desk like it weighed 100 pounds. 7 hikers, she said flatly. Gone without a trace over the past 6 weeks. All within a 5-mile radius in Mount Hood National Forest. I opened the folder. The top photo stopped me cold. Someone's hiking boot, foot still inside, cleanly severed at the ankle. No blood, no tear marks, just precision. Like it had been cut with surgical tools, not teeth. "No animal did that," I said. "We don't think so either," she replied. "We need you on this, Agent Weir. You and your team. Your plane leaves in 2 hours." That's how these things usually went. No build-up, no speculation, just facts and orders. I met up with Jackson Rivera in the armory. Former Navy SEAL, good in a fight, better with a dark joke to break the tension. He was cleaning his sidearm for the third time that morning. "Let me guess," he said without looking up. "Missing hikers, weird signs in the woods, locals getting twitchy." "Mount Hood," I said. He nodded. "Nice this time of year. Shame we're probably walking into hell." Dr. Lyle Kwan joined us at the runway. Xenobiologist, brilliant, never stopped thinking. He was already flipping through topographic scans of the region as we loaded gear into the plane. "Mount Hood has dozens of known caves," he said, "and a few dozen more nobodies officially documented. If something's hiding out there, it's got room." We flew into Portland under the usual cover. Environmental researchers from a fake university program. Unmarked SUV. Standard field packs. Gear that looked normal to anyone who didn't know better. Parkdale was a tiny town at the edge of the forest, tucked into the shadow of the mountain. One general store. A diner with peeling paint. A motel with a neon sign that buzzed like a dying bee. People watched us from behind curtains. That wasn't new. But the fear in their eyes? That was. Over dinner, a waitress named Martha leaned close while pouring our coffee. "You folks with the search teams?" she asked quietly. We didn't answer. She didn't wait for one. "My nephew's on SAR. He says the woods feel wrong, like they're watching. Said they found a tent last week, but the ground was too smooth around it. No tracks in or out, like the people just vanished." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Ever seen anything like that before?" Martha shook her head. "I've lived here 60 years. That forest's been part of my life. But lately," she looked toward the window, "even the birds are gone." After she walked off, Jackson leaned back and blew out a breath. "This ain't no mountain lion." I stared out the window into the trees just beyond the edge of town. Something was in there. Something that didn't belong. And it was waiting. We spent that first night at the Parkdale Motel, tucked just off the highway. A squat little building with wood paneling from the 70s and buzzing neon signs that never quite turned off. My room smelled faintly of mildew and old pine cleaner, the kind of place where the sheets felt clean enough if you didn't look too hard at them. Still, it was the only motel for miles, and it beat sleeping in a tent just yet. None of us really slept. Not deeply. I lay awake. The image of that severed boot from the case file burned into my brain. The skin too clean, the cut too precise. No animal had done that, and animals don't wait in silence. At dawn, we regrouped over lukewarm coffee at the only diner in town. The waitress, Martha, her name tag said, poured our refills with the kind of tired grace that comes from years on her feet. Her smile was polite, but the moment she saw our gear, I saw it falter. Just a flicker, but it was there. "You boys out hiking?" she asked casually. "Wildlife research," I said with a nod. "Studying migration patterns." Martha leaned in a little, voice lower. "You ought to be careful up there," she said. "Things ain't been right lately." Jackson perked up, always quick on the draw. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glanced toward the window like someone might be watching. "My cousin works search and rescue. Says they've been getting calls. People going missing, whole camps vanishing. And the woods, it's just too quiet now. No birds. No critters. Folks who grew up here say it's never been like this." It wasn't just her. We spent the day split up around town. Jackson hung around the general store and chatted with a guy changing spark plugs in the back lot. I went to the gas station and bought a cheap folding map, talking to the old-timer behind the counter. Lyle wandered into the library, asking about old topography maps and cave systems. Everywhere we went, we got the same reaction: vague, careful words. Hesitation. A low-grade tension that seemed to simmer under every polite smile. They weren't clueless. They were scared. At the gas station, the man behind the counter, mid-60s, thick gray beard, and a Vietnam veteran's hat, leaned in once the place emptied out. "Used to hunt Mount Hood every fall," he said, tapping the counter with 2 fingers. "Not anymore. Haven't set foot past the main trail since last year. It's not the same up there. Too quiet. Like the forest is listening. At the library, Lyle found something better than books. Tucked into the back of an archive folder was a personal journal from a retired volunteer ranger, dated over 20 years back. He'd scribbled notes about strange rock formations, signs of animals gone missing en masse, and an entire section underlined. Caves run deeper than recorded. Sounds like breathing from the lower levels. Not wind, not water. Back at the motel, we compared notes in my room over some microwave dinners and a couple beers. The table between our beds was covered in maps, GPS gear, and Lyle's laptop. The pattern was becoming clear. 3 of the disappearances traced back to this area, Lyle said, pointing to a ridge about 8 miles off the maintained trail system. All experienced hikers. One was an ex-army guy, never reported in. No signs of a struggle, just gone. Jackson sat back, cracking his knuckles. Kid at the store said his uncle helped with a search party. They found a deer carcass peeled clean. No blood, no signs of tearing. Like it was dissected. Lyle frowned. You're thinking ritual? I'm thinking precision, I said. Intelligence. Something doing this with purpose. The room fell quiet. Outside, the sun was sinking fast, stretching the shadows long across the gravel parking lot. I watched as the wind barely rustled the trees beyond town. The silence pressed against the windows. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Lyle broke the silence. Base camp goes here, he said, tapping the map again. We hike in tomorrow. Set up near the ridge and go from there. I nodded. We move light and fast. No fires, no unnecessary noise. We're not alone out there. Jackson tossed his empty beer bottle in the trash. No kidding. I've had the hair on the back of my neck up since we got into town. I didn't say it aloud, but I felt it too. That pressure, like something unseen had already noticed us. Something out there was watching, and I had a feeling it had been watching for a long time. We left just after sunrise, our boots crunching over the frost-hardened trail that cut through the edge of Mount Hood National Forest. The air was crisp, cold enough to see our breath, and the sky hung low and gray like a warning. Each of us carried a full pack, gear disguised as standard wildlife research equipment, but inside were advanced motion sensors, thermals, and weapons most civilians didn't even know existed. I led the way, followed by Jackson with his rifle strapped tight across his chest, and Lyle bringing up the rear, nose buried in his tablet, constantly scanning the topography. The trail thinned as we went deeper, trees closing in tight, like the forest didn't want us passing through. I've done hundreds of missions like this, from Appalachia to the Yukon, and I've never felt this kind of pressure before. Not from the air, but from the quiet. There was no wind, no birdsong, no insects, just the rhythmic sound of our own breathing and the faint creak of gear shifting on our backs. Even the trees seemed to lean inward, crowding the path, listening. A few miles in, Jackson stopped and turned slowly in a circle. You hear that? He asked. I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to hear. No squirrels, no birds, he muttered, adjusting his grip on his pack. Even after wildfires, there's some kind of life left behind. Lyle chimed in, his voice low. Soil's dry, but there's no dust. That's weird, right? No pollen in the air, either. Like the place has been scrubbed clean. We pushed deeper. After about 5 miles, we stepped off the marked trail and into wilderness. The forest got denser fast, trees so tightly packed you could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Everything felt wrong. Not dangerous in the usual way. There was no scent of a predator, no rustle in the underbrush. It felt more like a vacuum, like sound itself was being absorbed by the trees. I started checking my radio, thinking something might be interfering with reception. Still functional, but the signal felt muted somehow. About a mile in, we crossed a ridge and came upon a small ravine. There, along the muddy slope, we found the first real sign something was watching us. Footprints, but not human. Not any animal I'd ever seen. They were long, narrow, almost humanoid, but the stride was too long, like whoever made them had a gait too wide to be natural. For toes, no heel, no claw marks, and the pattern stopped, just ended in the middle of the ravine. No return prints, no trail, as if something had just vanished into thin air. Jackson knelt beside them, brushing the edge of a print with his glove. Deep, he said. Whatever it was, it had weight. But there's no drag, no slip. Like it didn't step, it just placed its foot down. Lyle was already taking soil samples. There's a residue here, he said. Not quite mucus, more like a film. Organic, but doesn't match anything in my database. The air got colder. I could feel it even through the layers of my jacket. Not a chill from the wind. There was no wind. It was the kind of cold that settles in your chest and stays there. We moved on. Around noon, we stopped for water and a quick energy bar. But none of us were hungry. Even the birds above seemed to have abandoned this place. The silence was so complete, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Every step, every crunch of pine needles underfoot felt deafening. I checked the motion sensors. Nothing. But that didn't make sense. No squirrels, no rabbits, no birds. It's like the forest was evacuated, Lyle said. Like everything that could flee already did. Around 1 p.m., we hit the spot the satellite maps had marked as the last known ping from the Warren siblings, the experienced hikers who vanished 3 days ago. There was nothing but thick brush and trees. Not even broken branches or disturbed undergrowth. But something was off. I walked ahead, 20 feet, then stopped. A metallic smell hit me hard. Not blood exactly, but wrong. Like ozone mixed with old meat. I raised my hand, signaling the others to halt. Jackson was already scanning the tree line with his scope. Movement, he whispered. 11 o'clock. Just behind that cedar. I didn't see anything, not at first. Then, a flicker. A shadow? No, more like something stepped into a fold in the trees and vanished, like walking through an invisible door. I held my breath. Did you get a shape? Tall, Jackson said. 8, maybe 9 feet. Thin. Fast, Lyle whispered. Could be refraction camouflage. Some deep-sea creatures can bend light around them. Could be something similar. No heat signature, I said, checking my scope. But the air pressure's dropping. Feel that. My ears popped. Then the silence deepened. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. Like sound had been sucked right out of the air. Like we were walking through a vacuum. I heard something faint, just at the edge of perception. A hum, or maybe a vibration. It pulsed in my skull, not through my ears. And then it was gone. I looked at Jackson. He looked back at me. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew the same thing. This wasn't a regular cryptid sighting. This was something older, smarter. We found a spot half a mile farther in and set up base camp before sunset. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in under an hour. We didn't light a fire, didn't speak more than we had to. Every motion sensor was deployed, every camera set. I took first watch, and as the others tried to sleep, I sat under the trees, rifle across my knees, staring out into the darkness. That feeling of being watched, it never left. By the time darkness settled over the camp, the forest felt like it had sealed itself shut. There was no moon that night, just clouds hanging low like a heavy blanket and trees stretching overhead like a cathedral roof, trapping us in something far too quiet. You don't realize how loud the world usually is until it goes completely silent. Not quiet, silent. No bugs, no owls, no wind. Even the crackle of our equipment felt like it echoed too far. I was on first watch, sitting near the center of our small perimeter with my rifle across my lap. We hadn't lit a fire. Jackson said it made us too visible. I agreed. But the cold crept in anyway, numbing fingers and tightening joints. Every few minutes, I scanned the darkness beyond our camp with my scope, looking for heat signatures. Nothing. Not even a raccoon. Lyle had turned in early, curling up inside his tent, but I could tell he wasn't sleeping. His tablet screen glowed faintly through the fabric. Jackson stayed up a little longer, cleaning his pistol out of habit, not saying much. He was never chatty when things didn't feel right. And things definitely didn't feel right. Just after 2 a.m., one of our motion sensors beeped. Just once. Then it went silent. I froze. My eyes locked on the red blinking dot on the scanner's screen. Eastern edge. 30 feet out. I scanned with the scope again. Still nothing. No heat. No sound. I motioned for Jackson. He came over, quiet as a ghost, and knelt beside me. Something tripped the sensor. I whispered. Could have been wind, maybe. There is no wind, he said. We waited. Then another sensor went off. This one to the north. Still outside our perimeter. Same thing. One short beep, then dead quiet. I stood slowly and turned off the safety on my rifle. Jackson did the same. Suddenly, 3 sensors lit up at once. East, north, and west. They're surrounding us, Jackson muttered. I tapped on Lyle's tent. Get up. Now. He scrambled out in seconds, holding a flashlight and clutching the tablet like it could protect him. What is it? He whispered. We've got movement, I said. Could be coordinated. Could be a bluff. Jackson took a step toward the trees. Or it's curious. That's when I saw it. Between the trees, maybe 20 yards out. Just for a second. A shape, tall, thin, almost human in outline but off. Too long. Too still. Its head was wrong. It was tilted sideways like it was listening to something no one else could hear. Its limbs, arms, maybe, hung low, almost touching the ground. I blinked and it was gone. Did you see that? I whispered. Jackson nodded. Yup. Heat's signature? Still nothing. Then we heard it. A sound I still can't describe. Somewhere between a whisper and a hum, layered with static and something like breathing. But from inside your own skull. Lyle stumbled back, clutching his ears. It's inside, he gasped. It's in my head. I stepped in front of him, rifle raised, heart hammering like a war drum. Stay behind me. That shape reappeared, closer this time, just at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move like a person. It kind of swayed, like it was adjusting its posture, trying to match ours, trying to understand how to be us. The beam from Lyle's flashlight caught it for a split second. Pale, gray skin stretched too tight. No face, just folds, membranes, and pulsing ridges where eyes and mouth should have been. No eyes. But I swear on my life, it was looking at us. Jackson raised his rifle. I've got the shot. Don't, I said quickly. Not yet. It hasn't attacked. And just like that, it backed away. No sound. No snapping branches. Just gone. We didn't sleep that night. We took turns sitting up, weapons ready, sensors recalibrated every hour. I recorded a voice log. Logged everything I saw, everything we felt. We weren't alone out there. That much was clear. But what shook me more wasn't that something had been near our camp. It was how it watched. The way it moved. The deliberate pacing. Like it wasn't a wild animal or even a predator looking for prey. It was studying us. It knew how close it could get without triggering a full alarm. It knew how to stay just out of our scope range. It knew how to affect us mentally without even touching us. Whatever it was, it had been here a long time. And it wasn't done yet. At first light, the forest still hadn't woken up. There was no bird song, no rustling underbrush, not even the buzz of insects. Just that same heavy stillness that had been pressing down on us since we arrived. Jackson and I were already up, running on barely an hour of sleep, checking our gear and loading extra mags into our vests. Lyle sat hunched over his tablet, fidgeting with the signal relay system like it might suddenly explain what the hell we saw last night. We agreed to split up for the morning. Jackson and I would push deeper toward the coordinates tied to the Warren siblings' last known location. Lyle would stay back at camp to analyze the black fluid sample he'd taken off the tree and monitor our movement. The plan was to rendezvous by 1500 hours. We moved fast, keeping low through the underbrush, rifles at the ready. 5 miles in, and the forest got even denser. Thicker trunks, gnarled roots, moss climbing every surface like a slow, silent infection. The trail ended completely about halfway to the coordinates, so we had to bushwhack the rest of the way. Jackson stopped suddenly and motioned for me to look ahead. A clearing, roughly 30 feet across. The undergrowth had been flattened in a perfect circle, like something big had come down hard on it. The center was blackened, like scorched earth, but there was no sign of fire, no soot, no burn marks on the trees, just void, like the life had been sucked out of the soil itself. Around the edges of the clearing were strips of torn fabric, twisted pieces of gear, and a water bottle split clean in half, like it had been crushed by something with freakish strength. I bent down and picked up a scrap of nylon. "Backpack," I said. "Brands REI. That's what the Warrens were carrying." Jackson pointed at a tree just outside the clearing. "Blood. Not a lot. Not enough for a kill." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice low. "They were taken alive," he said. "We found drag marks leading out the far side of the clearing. At first, they looked like someone had been pulled by the ankles. But then the marks shifted, like the body had been lifted and dragged by the arms, then switched again. Inconsistent, almost confused, like whoever or whatever took them didn't fully understand how to handle a human body." "We follow this," I said, "just until the ridge." "Agreed," Jackson replied. "But we move fast and stay sharp." The trail took us deeper into a part of the forest that didn't show up on our satellite maps. The tree trunks grew closer together, and everything took on a blue-gray hue, like the light itself was changing. We started hearing things, not voices exactly, but rhythms, pulses in the air, like faint drums or footsteps one ridge over. Always just ahead, never quite in reach. That's when my radio crackled. It was Lyle. He sounded breathless. Movement all around the camp. I'm packing up to relocate, getting fast readings, heat signatures, more than one. I grabbed my mic. "Don't run. Hold your ground. You're safer with the equipment and perimeter." "They're already in the perimeter," he shouted. "They're not tripping sensors. They're bypassing them somehow." Then the radio went dead. Jackson and I didn't need to speak. We turned immediately and bolted back toward camp. The forest felt alive now, but not in a natural way. Branches snapped to our sides. Shadows darted through the trees. We caught glimpses of movement, long limbs, pale skin, blurs that moved too fast and too quiet to be human. We pushed harder, lungs burning, legs straining over roots and uneven ground. Every second stretched out, and the forest bent inward like a funnel, pulling us towards something we couldn't see. When we reached the camp, it was chaos. The tents were slashed to ribbons. Lyle's equipment was scattered everywhere. A blood trail painted the dirt leading into a thicket to the north. Then came the scream. High-pitched. "Human! Lyle!" We rushed in without hesitation, tearing through the brush, following the streak of blood and torn clothing. Just ahead, I saw Lyle, barely standing, staggering backward out of the trees, hands clutching his chest. His clothes were soaked in blood. His eyes were wide, wild, like he was looking through me instead of at me. "Not alone," he rasped. "They're not alone. They're watching us, studying us." His knees buckled, and he collapsed at my feet. Then I heard it, a wet sound, like something dragging across moss. Behind me, Jackson's rifle snapped up. "There," he said. I turned and saw it. One of them. Same as before, but closer now. 8 feet tall, thin as hell, gray skin stretched like plastic wrap over bone and muscle. It didn't have a face, just that grotesque network of folds and ridges twitching in the windless air. It stepped toward us, limbs bending wrong, like joints were optional. Its head twitched left and right, as if processing multiple angles at once. Jackson fired first, 3 rounds, center mass. The thing flinched, a spray of black fluid bursting from its side, but it didn't fall. It let out a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't loud. It was low, resonant, like a tuning fork struck inside your skull. Lyle convulsed on the ground, clutching his head. Then the creature lunged. It moved like a blur, faster than anything I've ever seen. It slammed into Jackson, sending him flying into a tree with a bone-snapping crunch. He didn't get up. I opened fire, every round landing center mass. The thing staggered, hissed, and jerked back into the trees, bleeding black. It didn't fall, but it retreated, vanished like it had never been there. I rushed to Jackson, but one look told me it was over. His chest was caved in. Blood was already pooling. Lyle was still breathing, but fading fast. His last words came out in a whisper. "They're learning." And then he was gone too. I was alone now. I gathered what gear I could, stripped the bodies of ID and tech, and started dragging them toward a cave I'd scouted earlier. It was small, with a single entrance and a narrow view of the surrounding forest. If I was going to survive, I had to make a stand, and I had to make it count. The forest was pitch dark by the time I dragged what was left of Jackson back to the small cave I'd marked earlier on our initial approach. My arms burned, my chest ached, and I felt like I'd lost more than just blood. Lyle was gone, his last words still ringing in my ears, and now Jackson, too, had been taken from me by something that shouldn't exist. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My adrenaline was running too hot, my focus too tight. If I let emotion in now, I wouldn't survive the night. I laid Jackson down against the cold stone, his face blank, lifeless. His rifle was bent from the impact, useless now, but I still took what ammo I could. I closed his eyes with the back of my gloved hand. "I'll get us out," I muttered, "or at least make damn sure they don't take me alive." The cave we'd passed on day one was shallow, but narrow enough to funnel anything that came through the entrance. That was my only advantage. I rigged what I could: tripwire from the perimeter kit, 2 incendiary grenades tied to a trigger rigged from a broken camera tripod. It wasn't pretty, but it'd light up anything that came sniffing. I figured I had maybe 3 hours until they came back. Long enough to set the trap, not long enough to rest. I took inventory of my gear. 1 full mag, 2 partially used ones. My sidearm had 4 rounds left. 2 flares. 1 high-frequency emitter Lyle had been experimenting with. I turned it on, placed it behind the rocks near the entrance. If they navigated through sound or bioelectric fields, maybe I could confuse them, give myself a window. And then I waited. The silence settled in again. Not peaceful, not natural. It was like the forest itself had forgotten how to breathe. The air didn't move, and even inside the cave, I could feel the weight of it pressing in, like the world had gone still, holding its breath. I stared into the darkness beyond the cave mouth, rifle up, laser sight off. My fingers were numb from cold and tension. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt elastic now. I fought to stay awake, slapping my face, biting the inside of my cheek. I couldn't afford to nod off, not even for a second. Then the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something shifted. It wasn't sound, not exactly. More like pressure, like the forest had exhaled for the first time in hours. My traps didn't trigger. No footsteps. No warning. Just presence. I turned slowly toward the back of the cave, heart hammering. There it was. Another one. Smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. The same stretched limbs, the same angular, unnatural frame. It didn't seem to see me at first. Instead, it moved toward Jackson's body. Curious, it leaned down, touched his face, like it was examining him, learning. I raised my rifle, slow and steady, and squeezed the trigger. 2 rounds struck its torso. It shrieked, a high-pitched sound that split the air like a siren made of ice. It spun, lightning fast, and launched toward me. I dove from the rocky ledge, hitting the floor hard. The wind went out of me. The creature landed where I'd been, snarling, limbs twitching in unnatural angles. I scrambled back, trying to draw it toward the entrance, toward the trap. It followed, slower now, wounded, but smarter. Smarter than anything I'd ever hunted. Smarter than it had any right to be. When its foot hit the tripwire, I hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the cave. Fire bloomed in the entrance, throwing the thing back. It screamed, thrashing against the stone walls, its skin bubbling under the heat. I emptied the rest of my mag into it, point blank. Still it writhed, not dying, fighting every inch of the way down. I grabbed the last incendiary grenade, yanked the pin, and shoved it straight into the vertical slit that served as its mouth. The detonation painted the walls black with its remains. I collapsed, coughing, ears ringing, the scent of burned flesh choking me. I couldn't hear anything for a few moments. Then I heard it again, far away. Not one cry, several. They knew. They knew I was here. I backed deeper into the cave, grabbing Jackson's sidearm from his vest. My hands were shaking, but I kept moving, kept thinking. I wouldn't survive another one. Not without backup. Not without a damn miracle. They were hunting us. Not for food. For knowledge. For understanding. We were specimens. A puzzle. And now, I was alone in their lab. The night wasn't over. The mission wasn't over. But I had one last job to do. Make it through till dawn. Then maybe, just maybe, I'd live long enough to warn someone. To tell the world what's waking up in the silent places. I don't remember passing out. One moment I was pressed against the far wall of the cave, breathing smoke and blood, gripping Jackson's sidearm with everything I had left, and the next, I was blinking awake to the sound of something wet dragging itself across stone. My ears were still ringing from the explosion. My right leg throbbed with pain from the hit I'd taken, and the taste of ash was thick in my throat. At first I thought I was hallucinating. There wasn't supposed to be anything left alive after that blast. I'd used everything I had. But there it was, another one. This one was different again. Smaller than the first, more lithe than the second. Its limbs were even longer, its torso narrow and almost insect-like. Where the others had moved with violence, this one moved with curiosity. It didn't charge. It didn't screech. It crept. I stayed completely still. Its feet made no sound as it crossed the blackened cave. Ash and blood smeared the floor. My traps were all blown, useless now. My rifle was out of reach. All I had was Jackson's pistol, and I didn't even know if I could lift my arm straight. The creature stopped a few feet away, just out of striking distance, and tilted its head to the side. It was studying me. Its face, or what passed for one, had those same layered folds of sensory organs, like petals that pulsed softly with breath. There were no eyes I could see, just those moving, shifting patches of tissue that seemed to drink in everything around it. I wanted to shoot it. God, I did. But something in me said no. Not yet. And then it did something I wasn't ready for. It spoke. Not with words. Not out loud. But in my head. It wasn't clear, not like a voice, but more like a pressure, a suggestion. Emotions without language. I felt it the way you might feel a storm brewing in your bones. It pressed images into me, fast and raw. A spiral. A black ocean. Heat. Cold. Darkness without time. Understanding. Curiosity. And hunger. It wasn't just hunting us. It was learning. Testing. I squeezed the trigger before I even realized my hand had moved. The shot was clean, straight into its upper chest. It let out a hiss and dropped flat to the stone, curling inward like a wounded spider. I scrambled up, using the cave wall for support. My leg buckled, but I pushed forward, dragging myself toward the exit. I had no idea if it was following. I didn't care. I wasn't going to be part of its damn experiment. Outside, the world was just starting to shift into dawn. The sky above the trees was pale and colorless. A kind of fragile quiet settled over the forest, not the suffocating silence from before, but a cautious, almost reluctant calm. I made it to a ridge a few hundred feet from the cave, my body running on pure instinct. I collapsed behind a fallen log and pulled out the emergency transponder. The battery light blinked low, but it had enough juice left. I sent the signal, repeated it 3 times. Then I waited. Half an hour passed before I heard the rotors. The chopper came in low, unmarked, just like the one we'd taken in. I didn't even have the strength to wave. They found me slumped against the log, half frozen, covered in blood and soot. They loaded me up fast, too fast. I remember voices, flashlights in my face, hands checking for wounds. And then someone said, "We found another one. Different build. Still warm." They found it. The third one. Dead. But not by the grenade. By me. I wanted to speak, but my voice was gone. My throat burned too badly. I just nodded once and let them lift me into the helicopter. As we lifted off, I looked down at the tree line, at the cave's dark mouth disappearing beneath the canopy. I should have felt relief. I didn't, because I knew what I'd seen, knew what I'd felt in my mind when that thing reached out. They weren't just predators. They weren't monsters. They were scientists. And I was a lab rat that had bitten back. Whatever they were, this was far from over. They got me to the helipad just before the sun fully rose. Cold air whipped around my face. The rotor wash stinging my eyes as I lay strapped to the stretcher, blood-soaked and half-conscious. Two of the field medics flanked me, barking updates into headsets while checking my vitals. I was barely hanging on, but I could still hear it. Beneath the engine noise, the voices, the equipment, somewhere in the back of my mind, a low, rhythmic thrum, like something breathing deep in the earth. Still listening. The helicopter took off fast. No ceremonial sweep, no search for survivors. They knew there wouldn't be any. Jackson and Lyle were gone. That cave had nearly taken me too. The only thing I managed to keep hold of was Lyle's field recorder, tucked inside my jacket, cracked but intact. It contained hours of audio and sensor logs, electromagnetic fluctuations, heat signatures, strange ambient signals we hadn't been able to explain. I clutched it like a lifeline. By the time we reached the Unit 51 facility in Northern Virginia, I was drifting in and out. The moment we touched down, a team in clean suits wheeled me straight into decontamination. No one said much, just clipped instructions and neutral expressions. They ran blood work, took skin samples, hooked electrodes to my temples, and started scanning for anomalies. No one talked about what I'd seen, not until the debrief. That came 72 hours later. I sat across from a panel of stone-faced officials, 3 from Unit 51, 1 from Homeland, one wearing a CDC patch on his lapel. The lead was Director Carmichael, the same woman who'd signed my mission orders. Her voice was steady, detached, like she was reading off an invoice. "Agent Weir, we've reviewed the audio logs. The remains you retrieved are undergoing biological analysis. Tell us again, in your own words, what happened in the cave." So I told them. Everything. From the first step into Mount Hood's unnatural silence, to Lyle's last words and Jackson's final breath. I described the way the creatures moved, the eerie intelligence behind their eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, the strange sensory organs, the quiet observation. I told them about the second one, how it didn't attack right away, how it reached out to me, how it tried to communicate, how it made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. When I finished, no one spoke for a while. Then the CDC rep leaned forward, swiping through images on a tablet before handing it to me. I stared down at a series of microscope slides. At first, they just looked like distorted cells. Black rings, oddly shaped nuclei. But then I saw the comparison next to it. Human neural tissue. Next to the same tissue with additions. "This is from the fluid you found," he said. "The black substance. We're calling it Type X for now. It's biological, yes, but nothing like we've encountered. Not a virus, not a bacterium. It bonds with living tissue but doesn't damage it. Instead, it enhances it, grows with it, like it's trying to improve it." He didn't say the word colonization, but it hung in the air like fog. Carmichael leaned forward. "We believe they were testing you, Agent Weir. You, Jackson, and Lyle. Trying to understand us, what we are, how we react. They didn't just kill your team, they observed them. They wanted to see how you would survive, what choices you'd make." I thought of Lyle's broken body laid out in that cave, the way his flesh had been peeled back in careful, patterned layers. Not savagery, precision, like an anatomy lesson. "They're learning," I said. "They're learning fast," she replied. "The samples Lyle collected were enough to confirm it. Whatever these things were, they weren't mindless killers. They were a species evolved in isolation, likely underground, maybe for thousands of years. No one could say how long they'd been down there, how far their tunnels reached, or how many there were. The satellite imagery they pulled up next showed thermal disturbances spreading out from the Mount Hood region. Not just one cave, a network, a system. That was when they said the words that really chilled me. Omega level classification. It meant one thing. This wasn't something they could contain with fences or warnings. It meant there were no plans for public awareness, no media alerts, no press conferences. It meant this wasn't a crisis. It was a secret. I asked what would happen to the mountain, the ranger station, the missing hiker cases. Forest fire, someone said. Lightning strike. That's the current narrative. They'd already scrubbed the site, burned the gear, sterilized the cave entrance. Jackson and Lyle's families would get service medals and folded flags. Closed casket funerals. No explanations. I was given 2 weeks of recovery leave. I spent most of it staring at the ceiling in a secure safe house, wondering if the silence in my head was real or just a lull. I still heard it sometimes. The echo of those sensory pulses, the breath-like vibrations in the cave walls, the feeling that something was just barely out of sight. But I didn't tell anyone that. The recorder was locked away in the archives. The samples went to a black site lab in Nevada. My mission file was sealed. I thought that was the end of it, until I got a call from Captain Reed. He spoke quietly, like someone who knew they were being listened to. "You need to come in," he said. "We've got movement. Not just at Mount Hood. They're showing up in other places. And they're not just hiding anymore." I asked him what he meant. "They're spreading," he said. "And they remember you." After I got that call from Captain Reed, something in me shifted. The mission was over, at least on paper, but I knew that whatever we'd walked into at Mount Hood, it wasn't finished with us. That forest, those things, they had left a mark. Not just on me physically, though the pain in my leg and the nightmare said otherwise. It was deeper, like I'd seen too much, like something was waiting just out of reach, watching to see what I'd do next. I reported back to Unit 51 headquarters 2 days later, walking into a briefing room already thick with tension. Carmichael was there again, along with a few new faces, high-ranking military, a couple of suits from Homeland Security, and a CDC virologist I recognized from the Nevada lab. They didn't waste time with small talk. The images on the screen behind them did all the talking. Thermal maps, topographical overlays, satellite shots of Mount Hood's eastern ridges glowing with unnatural heat signatures. And not just there. New hotspots were lighting up across the Pacific Northwest, Gifford Pinchot, Willamette, even parts of Northern California. The network was spreading. Carmichael took the lead. Her voice was tight, like she hadn't slept. "We've had 3 more disappearances in the last 2 weeks. Same pattern, experienced hikers, off-trail, radio contact cut off mid-sentence. No animal tracks, no signs of struggle, just gone." They showed us drone footage. One clip stuck with me. A ranger team exploring what looked like a collapsed tunnel entrance. The video glitched as the lead agent approached, then cut out entirely. No signal interference. No explanation. When they retrieved the drone's memory card, the last frame captured a dark figure half hidden behind the trees. Too tall. Too thin. Its outline blurry, like it didn't quite belong in our world. Reed stood and handed me a folder. Inside were pages stamped Omega level, eyes only. The language was clinical, but the message was clear. The incident at Mount Hood had been reclassified from unknown biological threat to adaptive subterranean intelligence. Not a fluke, not an isolated predator, an intelligent species, one that knew how to avoid cameras, how to study us, how to stay just behind the curtain of human awareness. They'd built their homes deep underground, possibly for millennia, waiting. And now something had changed. Maybe climate shifts, maybe seismic activity, Or maybe they just decided it was time to step back into the world. The official story was already in motion. A fire season anomaly would explain the scorched zones where the cave systems had collapsed. Mount Hood was listed as temporarily restricted due to wildfire cleanup and geological instability. Publicly, it was just another natural event in a year full of them. No one would ask too many questions. They never do. Inside Unit 51, though, everything was shifting. An entire floor of our underground facility was being cleared out to study the samples we brought back. That black ichor, the fluid from the creature, was still active under microscope, still moving like it had a mind of its own. The biologists said it reacted to heat, sound, even light patterns. It was more than a body fluid. It was a communication medium, possibly even part of their neural system. Worse, they'd found traces of it in water samples from miles outside the known tunnel system. That meant the creatures had spread farther than we thought, or that there were more nests already active in other places. I tried to sleep that night, but I kept waking up thinking about Lyle and Jackson. The way Lyle had whispered they're studying us. That hadn't been a guess. He'd seen it, felt it. They hadn't just attacked our team to kill. They wanted to learn, dissect, replicate. They were running tests of their own. I started keeping a journal again, something I hadn't done since my rookie years in the field. It helped a little. Writing it all down made it feel like I had some control. But even as I wrote, I knew we were behind, outmatched. These weren't creatures we could bomb into extinction or trap behind fences. They were already among us, moving in silence, underground, underwater, maybe even inside us. 1 week later, I met Reed again at a bar in Arlington. He looked worse than last time. Gaunt, bags under his eyes, same 1,000-yard stare I saw in the mirror every morning. He slid me a flash drive under the table and didn't say a word until we were halfway through our drinks. "They're adapting faster than we thought," he said, voice low. "We lost contact with the Gifford team yesterday. No bodies, no gear. Just a blood trail that stopped like someone pulled the plug on reality." I asked him what the higher-ups were planning. "More containment zones," he said. "More classified operations. Same playbook, but we both know it's not enough. This isn't about control anymore. It's about survival." He paused, then leaned in closer. "I think we need to start thinking about what happens when containment fails." That night, I drove home in silence. No radio. No noise, just the sound of my tires on the highway and the low hum of anxiety in the back of my skull. I passed 3 different lakes on the way and caught myself gripping the wheel tighter every time, looking too long into the water, listening for something that wasn't supposed to be there. At headquarters, they gave the operation a new name, Project Cold Echo, a reference to the sonar anomalies we'd picked up beneath Mount Hood. It was now a standing assignment with cross-agency involvement, multinational data sharing, and round-the-clock surveillance of active tunnel regions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it would be enough. Because this wasn't just a new predator or some undiscovered animal. It was an intelligence, a colony, a civilization older than ours. Quiet, patient, evolving. And now that it had noticed us, it wasn't going to look away. I got the call just after midnight. No caller ID, no location tag, just the familiar voice of Captain Reed on the other end of the line, low and urgent. "They're back," he said. "Mount Hood. It's active again. We've got movement." Those words cut through me like a cold wind. I hadn't been back since the incident. Since I dragged myself out of that cave with 2 dead teammates and a head full of things I couldn't unsee. The world had kept turning since then. Press briefings, sanitized reports, cover stories about rock slides and natural predators. But I'd known this wasn't over. We all did. "We've got a new team going in at first light," Reed continued. "I need you there. You're the only one who's made it out alive. You know how they move." I should have said no. I should have slammed the phone down and gone back to pretending to sleep. But instead, I found myself throwing my old field gear into a duffel bag before the line even went dead. By sunrise, I was back on a blacked-out military transport heading toward Oregon, sitting between a pair of rookies who still had the shine of belief in protocol on their faces. They didn't know, not yet, that this wasn't the kind of mission you came back from unchanged, if you came back at all. Reed met us at the new Forward Operations Base, a camouflage structure hidden off an old fire road, deep in the trees. He looked worse than I remembered, hollowed out, haunted, like someone who'd been listening to whispers in the dark for too long. "They started again 2 nights ago," he said, sliding a map across the table. "Motion sensors triggered. Small teams went dark. Last transmission was just static, same as yours a year ago. And then we found this." He handed me a photo. A shredded camp. No bodies. Just torn fabric, footprints that didn't match human stride length, and a symbol carved into the bark of a pine tree. 3 long slashes with a crescent underneath. I'd seen that shape before, down in the tunnels. It wasn't a warning. It was a mark. "They're hunting in a pattern," I said. "Corralling people. Hurting them." "Exactly," Reed replied. "Which means they're learning." The team we were joining was mostly new faces, soldiers, scientists, a few spooks from Homeland and Noah. But there was one familiar figure waiting at the edge of the briefing room. "Agent Nakamura. I told you they wouldn't stay quiet," she said, offering a small nod. She hadn't aged much. Still sharp-eyed. Still carrying herself like a woman who slept with a loaded pistol on the nightstand. But there was something heavier in her voice. She'd seen more. Too much. "We moved out just after dusk. Standard unit, 51 formation. 4-man fire teams with perimeter sweepers, thermal imaging, and electromagnetic pulse detectors. I carried a compact rifle, 2 handguns, and a satchel of those modified crystal devices. Same kind Cody and I had used up north. They helped, but they didn't make us safe. Just slightly harder to hear. The forest was even quieter than I remembered. Not just empty, hollow, like something had scooped out the sounds and replaced them with expectation. I caught movement on the ridge just before midnight. A flicker of something tall and thin, moving wrong, like a puppet with its strings pulled by wind. It watched, then slipped away. By the time we reached the last known location of the missing team, it was obvious they'd been led here. Drag marks, slashed gear, and that same carved symbol on 3 separate trees surrounding the site. Like they were mapping territory, or staking a claim. I volunteered to go with the inner recon team, Nakamura and 2 field techs. We followed the signs into a narrow ravine, where moss-covered stones blocked the moonlight and the air tasted metallic. At the base of the rock wall, we found it, a new tunnel entrance. Fresh, damp, the edges slick with black ichor that shimmered under our lights. "We're going in," Nakamura said, her voice calm but tight. Minimal noise. No comms unless critical. The descent was steep, the tunnel spiraling deeper than I'd expected. It wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, too deliberate. Every few yards we saw more of those markings, lines and symbols that pulsed faintly under ultraviolet light. Communication? Warning? Ritual? We didn't get far before we heard it. A low, rhythmic hum. Not mechanical. Not animal. Something else. It vibrated through our chests, like the ground itself was chanting. One of the techs, Jared, stumbled, clutching his head. "They're in here," he gasped. Inside my thoughts. We pulled him back, but I could already see the look in his eyes. Dilated. Blank. He was hearing them. Feeling them. Just like Janet Croft had. "Crystals," Nakamura ordered. "Now." We placed the crystals in a triangle around him, and slowly his breathing steadied. But he didn't speak again for the rest of the mission. We pushed deeper, weapons drawn, until we reached a chamber that opened wider than expected, maybe 40 feet across, ceiling lost in darkness. And in the center, lit only by the reflection of our lights, was a mound. Not dirt, not stone, bones. Human bones, stacked like a nest. Or a shrine. Then came the sound. It didn't start like a scream. It was more like pressure, like the cave was being compressed from the inside out. We turned to leave, but the entrance had collapsed behind us. They were here. Figures dropped from the ceiling, their bodies long and narrow, arms stretching too far, skin gray-blue and textured like coral. No eyes, no faces, just those vertical mouths, twitching, opening. We opened fire. Controlled. Precise. The rounds hit, some dropped, but not enough. Not fast enough. Nakamura tossed a flash grenade, the blast disorienting the things just long enough for us to carve out a path toward the far side of the chamber. I dragged Jared. Nakamura covered us. The other tech, Bill, was gone. I didn't see him fall. I didn't hear a scream. Just gone. A tunnel opened at the far end, narrow and steep. We ran, slid, crawled, for what felt like hours until daylight began to bleed in through cracks above us. When we finally broke the surface, gasping, covered in mud and blood, the rest of the team was waiting. Guns raised. Ready. Extraction came fast. Helicopters. Biohazard teams. Decontamination protocols. Jared was sedated and flown out first. Nakamura and I were taken straight to a mobile command unit. The official report said we lost 2. But I know we lost more than that. We lost time. We lost ground. Reed met us as we disembarked. He didn't say a word, just handed me a fresh folder. New sightings, he said. Not just Oregon anymore. They're moving. As I looked over the maps, California, Idaho, British Columbia, I felt it again. That pressure at the back of my mind. The hum in my chest. They weren't hiding anymore. They were expanding. And we had just become the first wave in a war most people didn't even know had started. We'd been planning the getaway for months. Just the 2 of us, a remote cabin in the San Juan Mountains. No cell signal, no emails, no noise. Just quiet. The kind of quiet you beg for when life's been too loud for too long. The place we rented sat high on a ridge, maybe 30 miles outside of Silverton. Rustic but sturdy, with thick pine walls, a wood stove, and enough supplies to last a week. The guy who handed us the keys at the general store warned us about the weather. Said the storm coming in was real heavy, not the kind you want to get caught in. We laughed it off. We'd driven in worse. Hell, we wanted snow. It was part of the charm. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had already dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the white slopes. The wind was picking up, whistling through the pines like it had something to say. I remember thinking how pretty everything looked, untouched, like a Christmas postcard. That first night was peaceful. We lit a fire, cooked chili, and watched the snow fall through the frosted windows. There was something comforting about being tucked away, with the whole world just blanketed in silence. We went to bed wrapped in layers, thinking we'd wake up to a winter wonderland. Instead, we woke to stillness, too still. I stepped outside early, just to get a feel for the weather. The sky was pale gray, heavy with more snow. That's when I saw it. The road we'd come up on. Gone. Just gone. A massive wall of snow had buried the trail. Trees were snapped like twigs where the avalanche had torn through. The path was completely blocked. I called back inside for her to come see, but the look on her face said she understood immediately. No way out. No way down the mountain. No signal on the phone. Just us and this cabin sitting on a shelf above a frozen valley. I kept telling myself it was fine. We had food. We had warmth. Avalanches happen out here. It was nature doing its thing. We'd dig out or wait for help if it didn't stop snowing. Nothing to panic about. But the longer we stood there, staring at that wall of snow, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. It wasn't just the avalanche. It was the silence. The forest didn't move. No birds. No rustling. Not even the wind anymore. Just that thick, suffocating silence. Like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Waiting. The storm returned with a vengeance that night. Around 8 p.m., the wind started howling again, louder than before. It slammed against the cabin like it was trying to break in. Snow whipped sideways past the windows, thick and fast, and the trees groaned under the weight of it all. The wood stove popped and hissed as we threw another log in, both of us pretending not to notice how uneasy the other looked. We played cards to keep our minds occupied, but every few minutes I'd glance out the window toward the blackness beyond the porch. It felt like something was out there. Not an animal, not a person, just something. Then, around 9:30, the power cut out. The cabin dropped into darkness, just the firelight flickering against the walls. We weren't surprised. It's a cabin on a mountain in a storm. But the sudden stillness, no fridge hum, no fan, no anything, made it feel like we'd been cut off completely from the world. Like we'd slipped off the map. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, just another howl pushing through the pines. But this wasn't the wind. It had shape, depth, and tension. It was a scream. It didn't sound close. Maybe half a mile off, somewhere down the ridge. But it echoed in a way that didn't make sense. Long, drawn out, ragged. It started as a cry for help and ended as something else. Something wild. Something broken. My wife froze mid-step, one hand gripping the back of the couch. I stood up slowly, straining to hear more. The scream didn't repeat. Nothing followed it. Just that damn silence again. You heard that, right? I asked, my voice low. She nodded without speaking. Her eyes were locked on the window, like she expected something to come crawling out of the trees at any second. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the front door, stepping out into the freezing night. The snow was already past my knees on the porch. I swept the light across the tree line, but everything was a blur of white and black shadows. No movement. No signs of anyone. I'm going out a little ways, I said, just to check. Someone could be stuck. She didn't like it, but she knew there was no arguing. I bundled up, grabbed the emergency whistle, and made my way into the storm. The snow swallowed every footstep. The light from the cabin faded fast behind me. I called out twice, short and loud, "Hello? Is someone out there?" But the only reply was the wind swirling flakes into my face. I kept walking, maybe 100 yards, my flashlight bouncing through the storm, trying to find some kind of path or sign of life. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No sound. And then I heard it again. This time, it came from a different direction, closer, sharper. Not quite human. Like a scream through clenched teeth. A dying animal mimicking a person. It was wrong. Just wrong. I turned around and walked fast, back toward the cabin, never looking behind me. The snow closed in around me like it wanted to hold me in place. Every step felt slower, heavier. The wind felt hotter, like breath. When I burst through the cabin door, I slammed it shut and dropped the beam across the windows. My wife was already holding the axe from the fireplace. She didn't say anything. Didn't have to. We both knew we weren't alone out there. And whatever had screamed, it wasn't calling for help. It was calling for us. The wind didn't let up for the rest of the night. After the second scream, neither of us slept. We sat near the fire, bundled in blankets, listening for anything. Footsteps in the snow, a knock on the door, another scream. But the only thing we heard was the storm howling like it was alive and furious. The fire burned low around 3 a.m., and I stepped outside just long enough to grab more firewood from the covered bin. That short trip was enough to see that we weren't going anywhere anytime soon. The snowdrifts were nearly chest-high in places. The truck we'd driven up here was buried past the windows. Even the trail down to the road was gone, vanished under a blanket of untouched snow. The whole mountain felt sealed off from the rest of the world. Back inside, I told my wife what I'd seen. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked the one question that had been sitting heavy between us all night. What if someone's out there? I didn't have an answer. Not one I liked. We talked about hiking down once the weather cleared, maybe looking for a ranger station or help, but the more we thought about it, the worse the idea sounded. We didn't know what we heard, or who, but whatever it was, something about it didn't feel human. And neither of us wanted to be stuck out in the open if it decided to come back. The morning came slowly, pale and quiet, but the storm hadn't stopped. The wind was lower now, just a steady whisper, but the snow still fell, fine and constant, like ash. We tried to radio for help using the cabin's old emergency unit, but got nothing but static. Cell signal was gone too. Even the emergency beacon light on the deck was iced over and dead. Then, sometime around noon, we heard the rumble. It started deep, like thunder beneath the earth. We stepped outside, and off in the distance, across the valley, we saw it. An avalanche. A massive one, carving its way down the opposite slope. It roared through the forest like a tidal wave of snow and trees, unstoppable. We watched in stunned silence as it tore through the area where the road back to town ran. That was when we both understood the truth. We were trapped. Completely, terrifyingly trapped. Whatever had screamed, whatever we'd heard last night, if it wanted us, it had all the time in the world. And now, we didn't even have an escape route. No one knew we were here. No one was coming. The mountain had closed its mouth, and we were inside it. We stayed in the cabin all day, trying to keep the fire alive, checking the windows every hour or so. The storm had finally begun to slow, but the silence it left behind felt worse than the wind. Around 5 p.m., we saw the sky open up for the first time in days. The clouds thinned into a hazy sheet, letting through a cold orange light as the sun started to set behind the peaks. The snowfall eased to a trickle, just a few lazy flakes drifting through the air. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. I kept pacing between the front window and the back door, straining to hear something. Anything. But the mountain was completely still. Too still. My wife sat curled in the armchair near the fireplace, watching the door. Her eyes were glassy with fatigue, but wide. She hadn't spoken much since the avalanche. We both knew no one was coming. Not tonight. Maybe not for a while. So when we heard the scream again, it was almost a relief. Almost. This time, it was closer. Much closer. It wasn't like the first one. This wasn't distant, echoing across a valley. It sounded like it came from just beyond the trees. Like it had been following us, circling us, and had finally decided to let us know. It tore through the woods like a knife. High-pitched. Human, but wrong. It didn't rise and fall like a person screaming in pain or panic. It held steady, like a siren or a warning. It rang out for at least 5 seconds, then stopped so suddenly it felt like the silence afterward was louder. I grabbed the hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. I'd never used it for anything more than target practice, but it felt better than doing nothing. My wife stood up without a word, walked to the back window, and froze. She didn't speak, just raised a shaky finger and pointed. I came up beside her and looked. There were prints in the snow. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Naked footprints. Like someone had walked barefoot through the snow toward the cabin and then vanished. No prints leading away. No signs of anyone falling, crawling, or backtracking. Just a trail that ended about 15 feet from the back porch. I opened the door with the rifle aimed ahead, stepping outside slowly. The cold bit deep immediately, but I kept moving, following the prints until they stopped. There was nothing there. No blood. No signs of struggle. Just the snow. And silence. Then came a second scream, this time from the opposite side of the cabin. I turned, heart pounding, just in time to see movement in the trees. A shadow, tall and thin, sliding between the pines with impossible speed. It moved like it was gliding. Too smooth. Too quiet. I didn't fire. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid it would stop if I did. Maybe I was afraid it wouldn't. I backed up to the door and slipped inside, locking it behind me. My wife was already packing. No words. No hesitation. Just stuffing essentials into our go bags. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. We had to leave. And we had to leave now. We didn't waste time talking. Everything we needed could fit into 2 backpacks. Water, flashlights, our phones, no signal, but we still brought them. Some protein bars, the first aid kit, and the old road map from the glove box. My wife wore 3 layers, her hood pulled tight. I had the rifle slung over one shoulder and a hatchet on my belt. We didn't know where we were going. We just knew we had to get off that mountain. We stepped outside just after the sun dipped behind the ridge. The light was fading fast, the snow crunching under our boots in sharp, wet cracks. Every sound made us jump. The wind had picked up again, nothing like the storm before, but enough to rattle the branches and moan between the trees. It sounded too much like voices, like whispers in the cold. The snow was deeper than before. It slowed us down, soaked our pants and gloves within minutes, but we pushed forward, heading south, toward the access road that had brought us in. Maybe the plows hadn't made it yet. Maybe the last avalanche had blocked the road again. We didn't care. If we could reach the Jeep and put even half a mile between us and that scream, it'd be worth it. After 20 minutes, we reached the ridge. We stopped dead in our tracks. The road was gone. The entire lower slope had collapsed, just like the one before. A blanket of snow and broken trees covered the switchback, burying it beneath at least 15 feet of frozen debris. There was no way the Jeep could make it through that. Hell, we couldn't make it through that. We stood there in shock, breathing heavy, hearts racing. I was about to suggest heading west, maybe find the creek bed we saw on the map, when I felt it again. That pressure, like someone watching from the trees. Not an animal, not a person, something other. We both turned at the same time. There was something on the ridge behind us. It stood still, taller than a man, dark against the snow, thin limbs like branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I couldn't see a face, just the outline, and a sense of something ancient. Watching, waiting. I raised the rifle. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared. And then the sound came again, not a scream this time. A kind of breathing, deep, low, like something inhaling the whole forest. It vibrated in my chest. My wife grabbed my arm and yanked. Run! We scrambled down the slope, slipping and sliding, crashing through the snow and branches. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close it was. I just kept running. When we finally saw the Jeep, I nearly cried. It was half buried, but still visible. I threw my pack in the back and started digging around the tires while she got in and tried the ignition. The engine clicked, then roared to life. Thank God. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and gunned it in reverse. The tires spun, found traction, and the Jeep surged back onto the packed snow of the unblocked section of road. We didn't speak for the first few miles, just kept going. Trees flashed by on either side. Every shadow made us flinch. We didn't see the next avalanche until it happened. We were maybe 600 yards from the Forest Service gate when the ridge above us cracked, a low, deep crump, like the earth had just shifted in its sleep. Then came the roar. I saw the wall of snow hit the tree line like a freight train, taking down entire pines like they were matchsticks. It was coming fast. Hold on. I floored it. The Jeep fishtailed, straightened, rocketed down the last turn. The avalanche chased us like a white tidal wave, just seconds behind. We hit the straightaway, saw the gate ahead, wide open, praise be, and blasted through it just as the snow hit the road behind us. I don't remember the next few minutes. Just my wife sobbing beside me, her hand gripping mine so hard it hurt, and my own breath coming in ragged gasps. We didn't stop until we hit the ranger station 30 miles down the mountain. Even then, I kept looking over my shoulder, because somewhere back in those woods, something had screamed, and it hadn't just been a cry for help. It had been a warning, or a call, and I wasn't sure which one scared me more.